Okay, now I will stop talking. I'm going to turn the floor over to Mark Price, who again is co-author of this report and a labor economist for the Keystone Research Center. Mark, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, John. John, can you see the screen as well?
Yes, we can.
Can you see this webinar box or
no, that is it. That is it.
Okay, great.
Okay. So we only see the PowerPoint.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. So, hello, everybody. We made it to Wednesday. Hopefully, we all make it to happy hour on Friday. I have been given a dangerous task. I've been asked to sort of give you the details, and asking that of an economist, can go very poorly for you, in the sense that I'll do my best to make it a lively conversation, but and try to avoid reading a manual for a video cassette recorder to you. In that respect, I may gloss over some details, and so John has done a good job laying out how you can ask questions here. You have before you on the screen my contact information if you just prefer to reach out to me by email or phone to sort of talk to me a little bit about what your issue is or get some clarification. And in that respect, I want to also add that, this is a policy proposal. So, there's another stage of this process, which is legislation. And I think, I wish that, ideas emerged from my head naked and perfect, but they don't. And certainly we've done a good job here of trying to talk to different stakeholders and get a sense for what would be a smart program, but it's inevitable that other people can improve it. So in particular, if you see, as you hear the details of how we've constructed this, ways in which to make the proposal better and more appealing to your community, certainly please feel free to reach out to me and talk to me about ways in which to do that. Because at the end of the day, the Keystone Research Center, we want good policy, and certainly the best way to get good policy is to get as much feedback as you can from a broad community of folks. So with that, let me begin with sort of the motivation for our look at this proposal, for our putting this forward. And that begins with some work that we did early in the summer of 2017, so last year. There was a new paper released really at the beginning of the year by a set of economists that had sort of this dream kind of data set. And that, I know that sounds very far-fetched, an idea that a data set could be dreamy, but in the economics world, these scholars put together with a variety of data sources, federal data on taxes and incomes and college attendance. They were able to compile a data set that tracked students who attended Pennsylvania colleges and really colleges across the country from 1999 to 2004 at some point in that period. And they knew for those students at that point what their family incomes were. So they had a good sense of where they landed in the national income distribution. And then they were able to find out what those kids made as adults in their early 30s. And that's important because there's a good deal of economic research that suggests, and this is somewhat depressing for those of us who are already over our 30s, that your relative position in the income distribution really does solidify around the time of your early 30s. So you may earn less than folks older than you, but in your age cohort, you're roughly where you will be throughout the bulk of your earnings years when you're in your early 30s. So you have this data set really that tracks incomes of your parents and your income as an adult. And in addition, it also tells you about the college you attended. One of the things that emerged from that finding is that public colleges in Pennsylvania, and you'll see that here in this pie chart, they account for 65% of what we would describe as the success stories, really the American dream, or a version of the American dream, if you will, where somebody from a low and middle income family, in this case defined as a kid with a family income that put them in the bottom 60% of families. Those kids grew up and got jobs in their early 30s and had incomes that placed them among their age cohort in the top 40% of earners. So that's upward income mobility. And 65% of those success stories of that upward mobility are students enrolled in a community college, a state system school, or a state-related university. So it is clear from this wonderful data set that public colleges in Pennsylvania are really a critical component of achieving the American dream for a lot of students. What's a little more distressing, however, and most of you on the call probably are familiar with this, especially if you have kids that are of age where they're thinking about college, we have seen over time since that study was done, and that study followed students who were enrolled in college from 2000 to around 2004. Since that period, there has been a rapid rise in tuition. Weighting tuition across the public sector by student enrollment, we find that in the last 15 years, tuition in the public schools increased by about 66%. Now, as you can see from the chart, tuition's up across the board, right? There's no place that's cheaper today than in the past. And that we think is a symptom really of the cheapest and most affordable and high quality option, public schools, also rising in their tuition costs. So we actually believe that a proposal like this, even though it doesn't target students who attend private nonprofits, it has the potential really of even benefiting folks who send their kids to those schools, because it's going to put some pressure on those private sector colleges to sort of rein in their own tuition increases. But so we've seen over time a rapid increase in tuition. And as most of you know, if you pay attention to the news, that has in turn generated a rapid increase in student debt. You're looking at here median debt across the different types of schools, community colleges, the state system, state-related, and the private nonprofits, and even the for-profits. And median debt across the public system, again, weighted by student enrollment, up 27%. So tuition's rising much faster than family incomes. Students are put in a difficult spot. They're going to rely increasingly on borrowing in order to fund their higher education. And there's even been some recent research from Brookings looking at student loan default rates and beginning to sort of worry about the students who started attending college after 2000. And there is rising concern that we are headed for a student loan default crisis, that default rates seem to be rising. And if you project them forward, there doesn't seem to be a reason for them to slow down, even though the economy has recovered. So I think we have done students a disservice by seeing tuition rise the way we have, and it's driven a lot of rise in student loan debt. Now, our concern, and it begins because that initial study early in the summer, we focused on the power of a public education in generating upward income mobility. Our concern then went back to that database where we observed students who attended college after 2004 up to 2009. So we don't have information on their earnings as adults because they're not old enough yet. But we do at least know the composition, the income composition of students within higher education institutions in Pennsylvania. And that's what you're looking at here. It's a chart telling you the change in the share of students from the bottom 60% of family incomes and their enrollment in state system schools. And you'll see there the gray bar, the state related, and then for comparison purposes, the private elites and the private others. The main takeaway here, besides the fancy economist downward sloping lines, is that we've seen a decline in enrollment across the public schools of kids from low and middle income families, and it makes perfect sense, right? We're effectively pricing them out. You do see, by the way, a slight uptick at the end of the period among private elites, and you'll often hear that in the news. You'll see discussions of University of Pennsylvania where they will waive tuition and fees for low-income students. But even among that tick-up, these schools generally don't educate most low-income, middle-income kids. They do let in a small sliver, but they don't represent the bulk of sort of the engine of upward mobility, which the public schools do. So we think there is a very serious problem in the way in which we are financing higher education in Pennsylvania and the United States. So this brings it back to a question, well, what's the source of this problem? And certainly one of the things that we have noticed is that we took appropriations by the state of Pennsylvania for community colleges, for the state system, for state-related universities, so Pitt, Temple, Lincoln, and the other schools in that grouping. And we looked at it over time, and in inflation-adjusted terms, state funding for higher education is down 25% since 2000. So again, the trends that we are observing in tuition and student loan debt are really being driven by a decline in public support for public higher education. So we want to take, of course, steps to sort of reverse that. What you're looking at here, if you saw the press release for the paper, we quoted a statistic. When you look at total expenditures on higher education in Pennsylvania, we rank 47th out of the 50 states for our per capita contribution to public higher ed. You'll notice way up there at the top, North Dakota and Wyoming. Wyoming in particular is doing the smart thing, right? Wyoming is a state that basically is heavily reliant on natural gas and coal extraction. They have rather substantial taxes that are derived from those industry sectors, and they are investing those in converting their workforce because, at some point, either that natural resource is going to run out or we're going to have to stop using it in order to fend off catastrophic climate change. So they're making smart investments now in their students. And certainly, as you'll see later, we suggest there's some things we can follow from them in terms of improving the relative contribution that Pennsylvania has been making towards higher ed. Perhaps because I'm an economist, I can't resist throwing another slide at you on the same issue. This, again, is taking state appropriations for community colleges for the state system and state-related colleges. It doesn't include FIA money, but for those of you that are familiar with the FIA appropriations, they're also declining over time. But it plots those appropriations against gross state product, which essentially is the size of our economy. So we are becoming wealthier as an economy over time, but we're contributing less and less of our resources to really one of the most critical components to our future economic growth, our capacity to attract students, to attract folks to work and live in Pennsylvania, and certainly to attract employers. So, on to our solution, the Pennsylvania Promise, and these are the broad outlines. I will sort of give you those here, and then as we go through some of the cost estimates, which I promise will be as painless as I can make them. The main thing to start with is what we are proposing is a last dollar tuition assistance proposal. So, and I'll get into some of the implications in a few slides of what that means, but in pretty basic terms, what we are suggesting is that you have a student fill out a federal financial aid application. That then we'll see if they qualify for federal grants. We'll also take into account any grants they get from existing state aids through FIA. And then you subtract those amounts from whatever tuition is at the affected institutions, and the Pennsylvania Promise will cover that remaining amount. So it's a last dollar tuition assistance proposal. And I'll sort of come back and explain some of the implications of that. So what we're proposing to do is cover 2 years of tuition and fees for any recent high school grad enrolled full-time at one of Pennsylvania's 14 public community colleges. So there are no income limits here. So any student, as long as they're accepted and enroll full-time at one of those community colleges, we will cover whatever tuition is remaining after taking out all other aid. I will come back and flesh that out a little bit as we go through the cost estimate, because there is a key difference that I want to talk about. Moving on to the next group, we will cover 4 years of tuition and fees for recent high school grads with a family income less than $110,000 for a student accepted at the state system of higher education. So here we do have an income limit, and we would prefer not to, but these are issues of cost of the program. We had to put in an income limit in order to keep the cost of the system down. There are a tremendous number of students in those above 110,000, and so it's trying to be as fiscally responsible as we can. We limit means test the tuition assistance for students accepted to the state system to those with family incomes less than $110,000. Moving on to the state-relateds, so Pitt, Penn State, Temple, Lincoln University. We will also provide tuition assistance within those institutions. The structure here is a little different, and it reflects the fact that basically we're going to limit aid in those state-related institutions to more or less cover tuition and fees as they would be in the state system of higher education. So we're not going to give students in state-related universities any more aid than we're already providing to students in the state system of higher education. So this, again, is a sort of a fiscal, an effort to keep the cost of the program down. Tuition and fees tend to be higher at the state-relateds, and so we are proposing in this proposal just to cover tuition and fees up to more or less what tuition and fees would be at a state system school for students enrolled in a state-related. Again, we can come back to that. And then, of course, another sort of component of the Pennsylvania Promise, we do include some additional aid in the proposal for adult education. We won't quite have the same limits, because sort of the basic idea is to try and encourage skill development in areas outside of bachelor's degree attainment. In particular, we think about proposing some money for apprenticeship training. I think our end sort of goal here is to make it possible for adults who wouldn't no longer, by virtue of the fact they're not a recent high school graduate, make it possible for adults to qualify for some tuition assistance to help them either finish their existing credits they've got, or to help them enroll in a workforce development program that'll give them some skills that'll lead to a credential and hopefully, certainly higher wages and higher incomes in the future. So another sort of component of our proposal is the establishment of the Office of Income Mobility. There is a growing body of economic research focused on, to put it rather simply, the more barriers that you put up for people, the less they participate in a program. So we're right now in a very hot political debate nationally and here in Pennsylvania over things like work requirements for getting access to health care through Medicaid. The purpose of establishing and erecting these requirements is basically to reduce participation. And to think of a less political example, we have good body of research, for instance, that examines people's use of a 401k. We know that folks who are automatically enrolled in a 401k have higher savings at the end of their career than folks who are given the option of enrolling in a 401k, right? So the basic idea is that the more barriers you erect for people participating in programs, the less they participate. And it's a pretty common sense notion. And what we're doing here in the Pennsylvania Promise is we're asking students to fill out a federal financial aid application, and that's a barrier. And we want to do what we can to reduce that. So we propose establishing the Office of Income Mobility in the Department of Education here in Pennsylvania, and that office will be charged with doing things like recruiting mentors, other students who've gone through the process to help new and prospective students. Basically, we're hoping that the office will sort of pursue proven strategies for making sure that students who they take all the right steps in order to qualify for this program. So make sure you take a college entrance exam. Make sure you fill out your federal financial application aid form. We think it's very important. If your goal ultimately is to improve income mobility, you've got to take steps to make sure that kids from low and middle income families get the necessary assistance to cross these barriers, which can be substantial and very important. And I think sort of to think about that motivation, I've given you this little graph here, and it basically looks at a achievement on a mathematics test for students before they enter college. And it's thought of as a simple way of sort of predicting whether you'll have success in college. And the main thing I want to point you to are the blue bars, right? Those are high achieving students who do well on a math exam. The horizontal axis there says low, middle, and high. That's socioeconomic status. So based on income and occupation of their parents, kids who are high performing, who do well and would predictably do well in college, are less likely to complete college than similarly high-performing students from high-income families. And I think this is probably the crux of our concern, and the idea behind establishing the Office of Income Mobility is that access to higher education, which is a critical pathway to income upward mobility, it's not equal for kids from low and middle income families, and we want to make sure that the playing field is more equal, and so we spread more opportunity. So I just wanted to take some time to talk about that, and we think that's a critical component of any tuition assistance proposal going forward, is that you target and make sure that increasing amounts of your attention are for those high achieving kids who could go on and do great things. And those great things not only benefit them with higher incomes and wages, but they also generate higher profits and opportunity for the rest of us. So on to the brass tacks. This wonderful table gives you the our cost estimates and the number of students affected from 2018-19 to 2021-22. So you see that the final price tag is just a little bit over $1 billion in the last year of implementation. That's that last row there is the total cost of the program. You can see the different components. We're $414 million at full implementation in the state system, $88 million for community colleges, $532 million for state related. We also do propose expanding work study assistance for students. Again, you'll see this as we go through. Although we are proposing to cover tuition and fees, the cost of attending college is still quite substantial. And so for those students that these kind of programs don't do enough for, we propose spending some additional dollars to help subsidize employment. And of course, we hope that folks will pay attention to research like Temple University's Sarah Goldrick-Rab, who talks a lot about making sure that there are these kind of employment opportunities that'll help students complete college and get good experience, but also pay for what is a substantial cost. You see $50 million for education assistance, and then of course $10 million, an average of $9 million a year for the Office of Income Mobility, again, which will be charged with making sure that students from every school district are aware and fill out their financial aid forms, even if they aren't quite sure that they're hoping to attend college. So on to the individual components. I'll focus most on the state system. There is a wonderfully written technical appendix which runs through each of the groupings to tell you how we came up with the costs. So I'll just focus here very briefly on the state system, and I would encourage you to look at the technical appendix for all the wonderful details, including some awesome endnotes. I'm sorry, I think data sets are cool. You can tell I'm a bit of a geek. Now, in terms of predicting sort of what this program will cost, we needed to come up with an estimate of how many students would be enrolled in the state system in each of the schools. We use past patterns of enrollment in the state system, along with projections of the number of high school graduates in Pennsylvania through the next 15, 20 years to come up with what we think the estimates for are in terms of enrollment in those institutions. You see that we then adjust, again, using federal data, how many students we think will qualify for the Pennsylvania Promise based on the income guidelines we have drawn. You'll see here we are proposing that when the program ramps up, students, for instance, who are sophomores or juniors or seniors will be able to at least take advantage of 1 or 2 or 3 years of tuition assistance. We won't make students who didn't start when the program started go without providing some assistance. You also see we come up with an estimate of an enrollment increase. And this is one of those sort of experiences that are quite sobering. Economics, if any of you have sat through an economics course, we spend a lot of time beating students over the head and abusing them with supply and demand. And then as an economist, you get asked to figure out what your impact would be on supply and demand for higher education. And you discover how little information there is and how difficult it is. I got some assistance from Lindsay Page at the University of Pittsburgh to sort of come up with these rough estimates. They're my responsibility, not hers. It's always embarrassing that we should be better at supply and demand than we are. But nonetheless, we do come up with an estimate what we think enrollment will change in the system. And that's only important because you've got to come up with an estimate for policymakers how much this proposal will cost. Just to briefly do really 2 things, sort of point you to how we come up with how much this will cost, but also to point you to another feature of the Pennsylvania Promise, the mobility grants. I'm going to walk you through very quickly here how we do the calculation. We figure out what tuition and fees are, multiply that by our estimate of enrollment. That gets us $610 million in this first year of implementation. We come up using federal data with an estimate of how much grant aid that students will have from existing programs, whether that's a Pell Grant or whether it's FIA. We subtract that existing grant aid from the total tuition bill. That leaves us tuition and fees net of grant aid, which is $333 million there. So that's the sort of Pennsylvania Promise last dollar tuition assistance that we need to cover that first year of the program. And then you'll notice there is an extra $34 million for something called mobility grants. We are proposing in the state system and in state-related universities that students with family incomes less than $48,000 a year will get, in addition to their tuition assistance, they will get a $2,500 grant, which they can apply to other living expenses. So this is, even if the Pennsylvania Promise covers all your tuition and fees, you will then be eligible for this lump sum grant. So that's $2,500 in the state system or in state-related universities. We have the same feature in community colleges, but it's instead of $2,500, it's $1,000. And you will see why in 1 second. So that gives us a total cost, at least for the state system, of $367 million for this program. And now let me sort of show you what our motivation was for including these mobility grants. This is a bar chart showing you the distribution of grant aid by family income. This, again, focusing on the state system. In the body of the report, we go through each of the schools so you can see how this plays out. The salmon colored bars, at least in my terrible vision, you'll see here that's kids with family incomes $48,000 or less. They get, when you add up that 10 and 11%, they're getting, just in last dollar tuition assistance, they're getting 21% of all the tuition assistance. So a tiny fraction, well, I shouldn't say tiny, but they're not getting as much aid as kids with $48,000 or more in income. And for those of you that are not familiar with financial aid, the reason the structure works out the way it does is that currently, driven especially by federal financial aid, the lower your income, the more assistance you will get. And obviously you can tell going through this presentation that that's the right values, at least from our perspective here at the Keystone Research Center. But when you layer on top of that existing financial aid structure a last dollar tuition assistance proposal, what that means is that the higher your income, the more tuition assistance you provide. So of course, one of the ways to deal with that is to have an income eligibility limit, which we do in the state system and state-related schools. But we also think it's important, and again, you'll see that as I go through this presentation, that students in those lower income categories get some additional tuition assistance, both to sort of even out the distribution, but also to recognize that although we are eliminating tuition and fees, the cost of attending college will remain substantial, and you will see that quite clearly in just a second. So with these mobility grants in the state system, $2,500 a student, we get the share back up to 35% in terms of the total package of aid. And we, again, explain most of this in the technical appendix. So moving from the state system to the wonderfully exciting table for the community colleges. I won't torture you by running you through this table, but the basic logic is the same. We predict out into the future what we think enrollment will be. Reminding you, community colleges, we do not income limit, so anyone accepted into a community college full-time will be eligible for assistance regardless of their family income, and then that's just a reflection. It doesn't cost very much to do that. We predict out an increase in enrollment in that system. The one feature for community colleges that's different that I haven't discussed so far is, for those of you that aren't familiar with tuition at community colleges, students who live within a sponsoring community that sponsors a community college, they will pay they'll pay a lower tuition rate than students who come from an outside community. So for those of you that aren't familiar, think of in-state and out-of-state tuition. It's the same idea for community colleges because we do have a local contribution, which is very important to the funding of community colleges where they exist. What we propose in the Pennsylvania Promise is that we will provide tuition assistance up to the level of in-district tuition and fees. So if you're a student from outside of the sponsoring area for the Harrisburg Area Community College, you will get tuition assistance up to the in-district tuition rate. So we don't quite reduce your tuition and fees to zero under this proposal. That's a complicated issue. I think our desire is to make sure that local communities that are not currently sponsoring a community college don't get away with continuing to do that. So our hope is that as part of this proposal, perhaps there will be an effort to put some money into expanding community college coverage throughout the state, because community colleges are some of the best low price, high quality options available to students. And we'd like to see their coverage expand. And we also wanted, though, to recognize that the local communities have made the sacrifice to fund their community colleges. In total, that little tweak in terms of it costs you about $30 million. And we talk a little bit in the proposal about different things you could do to try to raise that $30 million so that you're not putting that on the backs of students. Our hope is, of course, that schools will, or excuse me, that communities will either, partner with an existing community college or begin to sponsor one of their own, and therefore eliminate this problem. And I think that is the only key difference for community colleges. So I'm going to move on from those. This is the cost table for state-related. So it's a little simplified. And I think just briefly, since I've already mentioned it, for a student enrolled in a state-related university, effectively the tuition assistance, in much as the discussion previously about community colleges, it will be limited more or less to what tuition fees are in a state system school. So again, we don't quite reduce tuition fees to zero for state-related students, but as you will see, it does result in significant reductions in the cost of attending college. And so I think it's a compromise, and one that reflects that we're trying to keep the cost of this program down. And let's take a look at what it really does for students. Our proposal, our estimate is that the tuition and fees will fall on average $7,245 for students in the state system. That's a 34% decline in the total cost of college, and that's a cost of college that includes tuition and fees, room and board, basically what it costs while you're attending school. Community colleges, it's a 24% reduction, or $2,414. And in state-related universities, although, again, we don't fully try to eliminate tuition and fees, we are still talking about very substantial tuition assistance here, an average of $7,275, a 30% reduction in the total cost of college for those students. So, this is sort of the double-edged sword here, right? On the one hand, we sort of depress folks who are hoping for free college because it's not free. But it does also have the advantage of at least speaking to what I sometimes inappropriately refer to as the grumpy adults in the room who aren't so sure free is always a good thing. And I think, the proposal we put forward, it substantially reduces the cost of college, but by no means does it make college free. And so what you are looking at here, this wonderfully clear bar chart, is what our estimate is of the total net cost of college, so tuition, books, room and board, minus grant aid, under the Pennsylvania Promise for students. So I think, in particular, thinking about, those mobility grants, even with that extra work we're doing, it's almost unimaginable that we are asking for a student from a family with less than $48,000 a year to come up with $15,000 over, and that's an annual figure for 4 years of college. So certainly by no means are we making college free. We are making a dent, as I just showed you, but nonetheless, the cost of college remains quite substantial for students even after the Pennsylvania Promise. So it's a nice balance between doing important and helpful things for students, but also not making it completely free. Now, you have to pay for this. So we need $1 billion in order to finance what we have proposed doing. We lay out in the reports, in the body of the report, a menu of options, each scaled to fully fund it. So In the case of a corporate net income tax rate increase, increasing it from 9.99 to 13.99% will fund more or less the Pennsylvania promise. Likewise, for reenacting a capital stock and franchise tax. We lead with those because, again, the corporate sector is one of the key reasons that we have fewer resources available for public higher education. It's important to remember that we completely eliminated the capital stock and franchise tax in Pennsylvania, and that had the effect of reducing revenues available for all public services by billions of dollars on an annual basis. We will have a report coming forward that puts the current price tag at almost just over $3 billion in annual costs. And those costs are real because you've got less resources, less money. When you reduce or eliminate taxes, you have less money to pay for corrections, less money to pay for K through 12, less money to pay for higher ed. And we see the consequences of that for students. We include an estimate for a natural gas tax. It would, if it was scaled to West Virginia's, which is a 5% tax, it would raise enough revenue. The one caution I would add, as most of you are very familiar, natural gas or resource extraction in general is a boom bust, as certainly anybody from Wyoming or North Dakota can tell you. So you want to be careful in your design to make sure you take into account the fact that prices will rise and fall for reasons that have nothing to do with fiscal policy in Pennsylvania or in the United States. And if you're going to fund a program like this, you need to scale the funding appropriately because you don't want to not be able to provide the funding because the industry had a bad year. And then finally, my sort of favorite approach to this is a higher tax on income from wealth. So we would propose that the current personal income tax rate that is 3.07% on all sources of income, that we change it slightly. So most of us in Pennsylvania have only wage income. So we would leave the personal income tax rate on wage income at 3.07%. We would also leave the personal income tax rate on interest income at 3.07%. But then if you raise the personal income tax rate to 4.36% on all other income, so this would be dividends, capital gains, you would raise roughly $1 billion, which we need to fund this. We also have a separate proposal that would raise more money, a higher tax rate, of course, called the fair share tax, and the basic idea is the same, and it's scaled higher because it reflects there are other spending priorities in Pennsylvania. But I wanted to put forward for you a spending proposal that would at least sort of fund this program that we are suggesting folks support. I would just want to emphasize what this tax change would do. So if you're a family with an income less than $23,000 a year, this proposal would raise your taxes over the whole year by $2. Right? So it's a pretty modest increase. And if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that most of our aid is limited to students with less than $110,000 a year. So you see that the tax increases that we are proposing here are quite modest, and this is to reduce tuition and fees for 137,000 students across the Commonwealth, and with a good goal of increasing educational attainment in Pennsylvania. You see, likewise, that most of the tax hit is by folks in the top 1%, and that's because most of the income from wealth is concentrated in the hands of a very tiny fraction of folks. Maybe the last thing I will say in this regard is that today, non-elderly taxpayers who make somewhere between $66,000 and $109,000 a year, they currently pay 9.3% of their income in state and local taxes. That's double the share of income that taxes represent for the top 1%. So we are proposing here essentially to raise most of the revenue from the highest income households. And even under that proposal, those highest income households will still pay less taxes as a share of their income than everyone else. And so we think in a lot of ways this is a fair system. And particularly when you think about the impact of a college education on someone's position in society, a low-income kid becoming a high-income adult, it does have a nice sort of pay-it-forward feature to it, in the sense that we are proposing that if you are successful, that you then return the favor that was done to you through an investment in higher ed by paying a higher tax rate on your unearned income. With that, I think it is, well, I should start and say thank you, and then back to John.
Thank you very much, Mark. So before we take questions, and I'll explain in just a minute once again. Well, let me do that now. Actually, if you have questions, you can either type that question in the toolbar on the right, or you can click the button to raise your hand, and we'll call on you. One thing I just wanted to note, and we do have a question, so I'll read that off in a minute here, Mark. But one thing I wanted to note, so we released this plan yesterday in Harrisburg with the press conference in the Capitol. We had a number of legislators who joined us who are in support of the plan, and there was a lot of interest in that press conference. But one of the questions that we got both after the press conference from reporters that were there, and we've gotten since we released it online from folks all over the state, reporters over the state, is this legislation yet? And the answer is no, not yet, but that is in the works. And one of the challenges here, as Mark, one of the last things he talked about were the options for how to pay for the plan. I think that is a hurdle to get over, and we put forward a number of options like Mark ran through. We have options that we think make more sense than others for a number of reasons, but that's something that legislators are going to work out, and it's not necessarily the case where a proposal like this actually even has to have a direct pay for, but it may, and those are conversations that are happening with legislators, a number of legislators who are very interested in championing this plan. So the answer to that question is not yet, but to be continued, this conversation about what the actual legislation looks like from the plan. So with that, and again, if you have questions, you type them in, click to raise your hand. But the one question I see here, Mark, is what is the definition for the way that you utilize the data of a recent high school grad?
I think our intent is, again, as John pointed out, this isn't legislation yet, but our intent is within the last year. So we are, you got to start it up and make a choice about when you make folks eligible for it. Our initial proposal is essentially that, let's say we start this, you had to have graduated from high school within the last year.